Robinson, much like his idol and current heavyweight champion Joe Louis, entering a rematch was a necessary formality to put the record straight and to remove all doubt. Sugar Ray might have achieved a one-sided victory, but he was no Willie Pep or Billy Conn, or any of the other outboxers who were content to just collect points. Later on he will publicly declare that, quote, "Fighting to me seems barbaric. I don't really like it. I enjoy outthinking another man and outmanoeuvring him, but I don't like to fight." End quote. However, when it came to his fights, Robinson was just as much a knockout merchant as he was a dancer. The overwhelming majority of his fights had been won by some form of stoppage. Furthermore, 10 of his knockouts up to this point had occurred in the first round. Yet, when he had beaten LaMoka, it was the swarmer with the little fists and just 4 stoppages in his career at this point who had scored the fight's single knockdown. Returning to the 5th of February 1943, and neither man has been idle since their last fight. Robinson has fought 4 more times in the interim, winning them all as usual. LaMoka has claimed 5 scalps. The previous fight had been at the prestigious boxing venue Madison Square Garden, New York. This time they are at the old Olympia Stadium in the city of Robinson's birth, Detroit. The rematch is sold out. Robinson's amateur and professional records are combined to deliver an incredible selling point. He's not just a nicely rounded 40-0, an amazing record by any standards, but a victor of 125 fights, never once knowing defeat. LaMoka has his staunch Italian-American support, and also the expectation that he'll always give a good fight, but he's largely cast as the heel. Robinson, being the exemplification of physical fitness, is set to be inducted into the Army on the 27th of February and will tour in exhibitions for the war effort, with Joe Louis, who has been doing this for just under a year now. However, Robinson, who was already beginning to live the good life due to the huge box office success his professional fights were bringing, wasn't going to do too well on the $50 a week wage a private could expect. The Prince of Harlem, as he was already being called, happily took the hastily arranged series of fights across February. The rematch with LaMoka will be the first. LaMoka's childhood mastoid operation has exempted him from military service. He's happy to take another fight check and chew on through life in his cynical fashion. LaMoka's 5 recent wins and his knockout of Robinson in their previous encounter has given him better odds this time around. He's a 3-1 underdog now. There are other slight changes too. Robinson, a natural welterweight, is even lighter this time at just 144 pounds. LaMoka, who will always struggle to make weight, is at the middleweight limit of 160 pounds. In front of 18,930 people, the raging bull that is Jake LaMoka will take the fight to his matador-like opponent. For 10 rounds, the 2 men will exchange fierce flurries of punches. This is LaMoka's type of fight, even if it looks like he's trailing behind on points in the first few rounds. Conscious that his opponent is one of only 8 who has gone the distance with him, Robinson wishes to deliver a satisfactory tercio de morte. After all, he has stopped the great ex-world welterweight champion Fritzy Zivic in their rematch. More about Zivic later. For many, what will follow is yet another classic boxing parable about hubris, where the winner is not content with just winning, he wants to win a certain way. Billy Conn demonstrated it when he decided to close in on an outpointed Joe Louis in 1941, tempted that he could knock out the Brown Bomber after staggering him and sending him into a retreat in round 12. This mistake resulted in the light heavyweight being sent down for the count in the following round, and his dreams of world heavyweight glory violently snatched away. Rather than boxing clever from the outside, he went deep into the danger zone to trade shots with the champion. Louis had both the power and ring smarts to not look a gift horse in the mouth. He met Conn with punches that were both powerful and accurate, and backed up with the urgency of his coach, Chappie Blackburn, who had told his student he needed a knockout to win. 37 years from now, one of Robinson's biggest fans, Sugar Ray Leonard, will make the same mistake with the highly intelligent yet savage swarmer Roberto Duran. The Hands of Stone will be another fighter to be described as the best pound-for-pound boxer. However, despite his ability to switch ranges, Duran's strength will always be on the inside. At this stage in his career, Leonard will have yet to know defeat and will be the WBC and the Ring Magazine World Welterweight Champion. Ignoring advice from his coach, the highly respected Angelo Dundee, Leonard will choose to abandon his outfighting and go into the trenches with Duran. who will have publicly and personally baited him to do so since the fight was first signed. A boxer-puncher like the man he honoured his moniker to, few other professionals of his weight class will be able to beat Sugar Ray Leonard at this range. Duran will be one of those few by forcing the fight throughout and gaining a unanimous decision. Back on the 5th of February 1943, Sugar Ray Robinson comes out of his corner in the 8th round ahead on the scorecards. But the Icarus of the ring wants to fly higher. Frustratingly, Robinson has not been able to significantly stun the Bronx Bull with any of his knockout blows. LaMoka will regularly boast, "No son of a bitch ever knocked me off my feet," and Robinson is not going to be the first tonight. He senses wariness in the man with the dynamic hooks and the uppercuts, the man who doesn't understand the masochistic way LaMoka eats punches as if he were greedily ripping off chunks of salumi. After pursuing his quarry with patience and with a renewed enthusiasm, the time is right for Jake LaMoka. In his own signature style, he bullies his way past Robinson's sharp jabs and hooks, prizing him open for the gorging. He pummels in his infamous body shots and then goes to work upstairs. Robinson regrets every party and every late night he's enjoyed in the past few weeks. But most of all, Robinson regrets not taking this man seriously. LaMoka lands a heavy right to the head and then a left to the body, sending his opponent through the ropes. The count begins. One that Robinson cannot beat. However, just when it seems LaMoka's victory will be perfect, the reverberating sound of brass quashes the Bull's moment as the referee reaches 9. The bell has saved Robinson, but he knows this round will cost him dearly if he doesn't get his act together. With 2 rounds to go, Sugar Ray Robinson needs to get down to some serious business and keep ahead on the scorecards. However, he has not recovered from the physical and psychological hammering LaMoka handed out to him in the previous round. Worst of all, Jake, a master of crude brutality and intimidation, is not going to let up. Deprived of his early moment of triumph, LaMoka steams in again, intent on finishing the job. He doesn't get another opportunity, but Robinson cannot wrestle the fight back. Sugar Ray ends his unbroken string of victories with a unanimous decision going to Jake the Bull LaMoka. A rematch is hastily sandwiched between California Jackie Wilson on the 19th of February and his basic training in the Army of Fort Dix, New Jersey. Despite working alongside his hero Joe Louis, this is another abrupt change to his life. Having fought his way up from poverty and street gangs, he's begun establishing a life of flamboyance that will reach a legendary status as he holds court in Harlem. His change of pace in the army is a return to subservience along with his old name. It's a world that he has described as being in olive drab, from the uniform to the transport. California Jackie Wilson, already a sergeant in the army, is yet another underrated opponent who astonishes the audiences, and especially the referee of the fight, Frank Fulham, in being able to go the distance with Sugar Ray Robinson. Fulham will later say, quote, "I don't know what was keeping him on his feet." End quote. Make no mistake, he is no LaMoka, and this has been demonstrated a month earlier when Jake outpointed him. Robinson floors Wilson in round 4 for a 9 count. The press cannot help themselves with military metaphors. One journalist enthusiastically describes Wilson's mistake being his decision to trade long-range artillery with Robinson. Later, a biographer will muse that this is Robinson's last chance to thump a sergeant before basic training. However, we can imagine the Robinson skeptics and the more fickle sports journalists paying attention to the fact that the so-called quote-unquote uncrowned welterweight champion of the world had only won by majority decision due to Judge George Kelly scoring the fight a draw. A crowd of 15,149 people fill the Olympia Stadium in Detroit on the 26th of February for the rubber match between Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMoka. Robinson is up a pound since they last met, whilst LaMoka tips his middleweight bracket by 3/4. This time, Sugar Ray is focused and hell-bent on avenging the first and only loss of his career. LaMoka doesn't care. He's the same relentlessly charging force of nature that bores down on its opposition. Robinson takes full advantage of his lead hand, pumping in the jabs from the first bell onwards and readying his counter for LaMoka's onslaught. He doesn't have to wait long. As predicted, LaMoka follows his normal pattern of ripping into his opponent's midsection, intending to wear down their stamina. However, he hasn't counted on Robinson's legendary right uppercut that he sets up for just this occasion. Stepping back to ensure maximum acceleration, the perfect punch smashes into LaMoka's famous chin, impressing the judges early on in the bout. Whether it impresses the bull is a matter of contention. He's used to a broad variety of pain, and in his 38-fight career so far, he has yet to taste the canvas. By round 7, Robinson's strategy is again putting him ahead on the scorecards. However, this is where Jake LaMoka strikes back. It's another golden moment that he has patiently waited for, and a telling left puts Robinson down. Sugar Ray cannot deny the punch has left him dazed. He waits out the count before rising, and then works to take the fight back. This time he accomplishes his intended comeback and wins by unanimous decision. The referee gives LaMoka 3 rounds, but neither of the judges thinks he got more than 2. A good portion of the audience isn't happy with the verdict and voices their disapproval. Although this looks something like a combination of the previous 2 fights, and arguably not as good as the first one, Robinson seems jubilant enough to have avenged his single defeat before doing his military service. Far from being the first occasion LaMoka and his supporters believe they have been robbed, the Bronx Bull had this to say, quote, "I lost the 3rd Robinson fight. That's not true. I didn't lose it. He got the decision. You can ask anyone who was there, or if it means that much to you, read the newspaper stories. I know the date of the fight. It was the last week of February 1943, and Robinson was going into the army the next day. I'm not knocking him on it. I would have done the same thing in his shoes, but he got every newspaper inch there was about the story of this brave boy off to fight for his country. He didn't fight up to his best in the ring that night, but he got a decision by one miserable vote after I decked him once. That's when I began to think about Robinson as a nemesis. Well, no, not really. But if you score the only knockdown in a really tough 10-rounder and the judges give the decision to the guy you knocked down, you got to figure that things aren't really going your way. At the time, I figured, what the hell, I flattened the guy once before and I'll get him again when he comes out. I didn't figure he was going to use his army career as one long training camp." End quote.
These two had an unbelievable rivalry, and it is the exemplification, as you said, when we were kind of exchanging messages through Messenger, of the styles make fights paradigm. I don't know if there's any 2 fighters ever, maybe Gotti Ward, but that was more just blood and guts, 2 blood and guts warriors in there banging it out. But I don't know if there's ever been another rivalry like this one where you get 2 such opposing styles that fight again and again and again. I guess Frazier Ali is a good example. But it's pretty tough to find this kind of rivalry with this kind of depth and this kind of differentiation between the 2 styles of the 2 fighters.
Jake LaMoka will offer a variation on his commentary about the regularity he met Sugar Ray Robinson. Quote, "I fought Sugar Ray Robinson so many times, it's a wonder I don't have diabetes." End quote. The hindsight of history can be cruel. Throughout his long career, Sugar Ray Robinson was a figure of fitness. Both men would struggle making their weights, but it would be LaMoka who would descend into alcoholism and eventually obesity. But tragically, it will be a 67-year-old Sugar Ray Robinson who will die from complications caused by diabetes. He will also suffer from Alzheimer's disease. LaMoka, for all the punches he ate and abuses he allowed to his brain, would appear mentally sharp into his 90s. Jake LaMoka did have something of a point about Robinson's stint in the army. He flew through basic training, being in top physical shape, and was soon promoted from private to Corporal Walker Smith. He was transferred to the Army Air Force Base at Mitchell Field, Long Island, where he was soon assigned to train his regiment's boxing team in between guard duty. His celebrity status ensured that he remained popular, and he circumvented strict racial segregation rules. Unlike Joe Louis, whose career in the army appeared to be one long motivational drive for the troops and only fought in exhibitions, Sugar Ray is not totally exempt from fighting professional bouts. Mike Jacobs arranges for a fight on the 30th of April against Freddie Cabral over 220 miles away at Boston Garden. Cabral is put away at the 2 minutes 20 second mark of the first round. Next up, Sugar Ray Robinson wins a unanimous decision over Ralph Zanelli. Between these 2 fights, he is even able to get some early leave in order to marry his second wife. Sugar Ray had already been married, a father, and divorced by the time he was 19 and just turned professional. Now, during his time as a wealthy, famous and celebrity divorcee, happily immersed in the show business scene when he wasn't training, Robinson's notorious roving eye had settled on Edna May Holly. She worked as a showgirl in Harlem. On the 29th of May, she just so happened to be working in a Chicago club, and Robinson was able to wangle some leave in order to go over to the city, where the two will be married in her friend's Chicago home. Following the Zanelli fight, Jacob sees an opportunity he believes will be a good box office draw, but it's the first time Robinson has serious reservations. He is to face one of his greatest childhood idols, Henry Armstrong. Now almost 34, Armstrong has fought 160 fights, winning 134, losing 18 and drawing 8. He is the first boxer to hold 3 divisional world titles, featherweight, lightweight and welterweight, simultaneously, and defended his welterweight title, the one Robinson was working towards, an incredible 18 times. Despite winning his last 7 matches, it was obvious to all who attended that Armstrong's glory days were long gone. He hasn't fought for a title since finally losing it and failing to regain it against Fritzy Zivic in 1941 and 42 respectively. In financial trouble, he continued to box and box regularly, as he had done throughout his career. Since losing the belt, he has fought 2 to 3 times each month, only once taking a month off earlier this year. Due to the generally lower purses they received per fight, lighterweight divisions fought a lot more regularly than the heavier ones. Worse still, Armstrong's swarming style was usually regarded as the shortest-lived of the boxing styles, due to the amount of damage these fighters took compared to sluggers, outboxers and boxer punchers. Armstrong had 2 things going for him: his undeniably effective skill set as a swarmer and his unnaturally large heart, both metaphorically and literally. It is left to Uncle Mike Jacobs to convince Sugar Ray Robinson to take this lucrative fight deal. Robinson has outright refused to face his aging hero. Slick outside the ring as he is inside, Robinson has become a firm businessman since he turned pro. He demands his own purses and shares of the revenue. However, no amount of money will convince him to fight Henry Armstrong. Even when Armstrong personally contacts Sugar Ray to urge him to take the high payday, he's not swayed. In the end, Jacobs has to explain the financial problems his old idol is facing. Armstrong is broke, facing financial ruin, and he needs the money. 5 years previously, Henry Armstrong had won his world title, the undisputed World Welterweight Championship, from Barney Ross. Ross had been a Jewish hero who had taken up the mantle from the 20s world lightweight champion Benny Leonard in the 30s when anti-Semitism was at its height. A fighter who had also won a world title in 3 divisions, lightweight, light welterweight and welterweight, Ross used his performances in the ring as symbols for his fight against his people's racist oppressors. His final fight against Armstrong is regarded as one of the most courageous in boxing history, as the defending champion was battered from corner to corner from round 3 to round 15. During the opening rounds, he had shown some hope by boxing clever with a pendulum-style attack and retreat, but this had only worked for so long. By round 7, his face was a mess and one eye was swollen shut. By round 10, he had little left to give and could not handle Armstrong's claustrophobic style of manhandling in the clinch. Nevertheless, Ross would not let his corner throw in the towel. "I'm not quitting. If you stop it, I'll never talk to you again," he told his cornerman. In the later rounds, ringsiders joined in with the sentiment of Ross's corner, and they begged the officials to stop the massacre. Referee Arthur Donovan stepped between rounds to be the voice of reason and explained he was going to have to stop the match. Ross pleaded, "Let me finish." Donovan had replied, "You can't protect yourself." Ross offered a compromise. Having fought 80 times in the past decade, he knew his fight days were over. "I'll never fight again, I promise you that, if you let me finish." He extends the plea again to his corner. "Let me finish like a champion." And finish Ross did on his feet, and to the cheers of his people and everyone else who watched that bout, having never been knocked out in his career. He would go on to serve in active duty during World War II, whereas other famous ex-world champions would take on ceremonial roles. However, on the night he lost his title but retained his pride, few people consider the role the new rising star had to play. Sifting through the reports and witness statements of the time, we note that homicidal or hurricane Henry Armstrong made the noble and merciful decision to back off. In his corner, the swarming master told his team, "I don't want to crucify him. I don't want to hurt him anymore." Armstrong's career would end with 101 of his 151 victories being knockouts. Prior to this fight, he had strung together 27 consecutive knockouts, a record that would not be bested for years. At the peak of his powers, as he was on that fateful day, he was more than capable of sending Ross out on a stretcher after round 10, but he recognised what the man stood for and respected what he was trying to do that night. An agreement was reached between the two corners and between the two fighters as they spoke in clinches, almost, but not quite like pro wrestlers calling spots. Those days were now over. Now Armstrong was in a position not far removed from Barney Ross in 1938. He is fighting off his past glories. Much like Barney Ross when he lost the belt, it isn't so much about the age of the fighter — Ross had only been 3 years Armstrong's senior — but the mileage on their bodies. Armstrong had yet to prove himself through the bloody, courageous wars he fought against Lou Ambers, Seferino Garcia, Fritzy Zivic, Lou Jenkins and Willie Joyce. Sugar Ray Robinson now faces a man who over 5 years has been through all those wars. He's fought Joyce twice that year, losing the first where sports writers were already saying he little resembled his title-holding days. Needless to say, Sugar Ray Robinson is won over by Mike Jacobs. Armstrong was taking fights anyway. Robinson might as well lend his name to an event that would help the fading star out and perhaps secure his retirement. Crowds would come to watch the old hero of the welterweight division take on the promising up-and-comer. Indeed, a gate of $60,789 is taken from the 15,371 people in attendance on the 27th of August 1943 at Madison Square Garden. From the opening bell, Sugar Ray moves to the outside as he always has done. This would always be a wise tactic to employ when facing Henry Armstrong, the legendary swarmer with the big right hand. He peppers Armstrong with jabs, testing his opponent's reflexes. Fighting at long range, Robinson can almost score shots at will, and the early rounds see the game Armstrong trying to move in on his quarry as his head is rhythmically snapped back. The hopping left hooks, an early example of the gazelle punch Armstrong used to close the distance to many of his past opponents, has little effect on Sugar Ray's lightning slips and lead hand counters. It becomes apparent that Robinson can play this game all night long. He won't be worn out by Armstrong's continuous forward pressure, having had to handle Jake LaMoka 3 times already. Half of the problem Armstrong's victims faced was trying to fight him off, never mind being able to force the fight on their own terms. However, such aggressive encroaching is a plodding, ponderous shadow of the unyielding tidal wave of the past. Robinson is careful to avoid the mid-range. It's not really an option, as it's where the slugfests ensue. However, sniping at his head with punch after punch is only going to go one way and one way fast. He needs to change tactics, one that will be enough to show the judges and yet not render his idol a bloody pulp. He resolves to go downstairs to avoid a knockout with his signature body jabs and right hooks. When sparring in gyms, allowing body shots only is a common method used for beginners or between old veterans. Without the risk of a direct concussion or facial damage, it's regarded as a much friendlier way to box. However, as a future legendary swarmer Smokin' Joe Frazier will state, kill the body and the head will die. Just below the pectoral muscles, there's a smorgasbord of fight-ending targets. Old-school boxers often spoke about working a spot just below the heart, a target later known as the spleen shot. History's lightest gloved world heavyweight champion, Bob Fitzsimmons, dethroned gentleman Jim Corbett with a paralysing left uppercut to the solar plexus, care of his stance-switching Fitzsimmons shift manoeuvre. Rocky Graciano's arch-rival Tony Zale's best combination began with a right uppercut to the same region, followed by a left hook to the head. The liver punch has perhaps the most infamous reputation for its brutal knockout efficiency. Although regular hooks and uppercuts can cause significant trauma to the body's largest gland, the upward diagonal trajectory of the left shovel hook makes the technique a precision tool to do the job. Sugar Ray was adept at delivering any of these punches, but preferred to rip into the kidney with his right hook, either inside or around his opponent's left arm. This was usually set up with his jab to the solar plexus that baits a left hook or uppercut to his head. It works well on Armstrong. Too well. Ever sensitive to an opponent's behaviours, Robinson sees his hero sag. In order to help prevent a knockout, he sees little other option than to meet the old hurricane on his own terms. Fearing this will result in a knockout, he moves into the clinch as much to hold his opponent up than as a means to win the fight. It's Armstrong's most deadly range, where he has always forced the fight and where his fearsome reputation has been forged. Robinson's new plan works. He wrestles the toothless lion inside his den and, at least on one level, preserves his dignity. The fight is emotive, with a respectful audience refusing to boo what many believed was a noble Sugar Ray fighting carefully to neither seriously injure nor humiliate his hero. Fortunately, it isn't the blood-soaked destruction that Armstrong inflicted on Ross for 8 of their 15 rounds. Rather, it resembles a tough sparring contest or exhibition bout of 10 rounds that, if there had been any justice, should have been a respectful, metaphorical handing over of the baton, with Henry Armstrong entering into retirement. At the time, Robinson won't hear anyone describe the bout as anything but a legitimate contest. Staying loyal to the man who inspired him and his teenage sparring partners in Harlem, he steadfastly claims that he would have knocked out Armstrong if he could. Armstrong, for his part, is just as obliging and is perhaps honest about Robinson. He tells the press, quote, "No, I couldn't have handled Robinson on the best night I ever had," end quote. Just when Sugar Ray Robinson was beginning his basic training in Long Island, Jake LaMoka was ending his feud with another rival, the aforementioned Jimmy Reeves. This was the man who had almost caused a riot when he gained a split decision over the Bronx Bull, handing the Swarmer his first loss. However, there was something about LaMota's fights. Even if he lost, he would win over a substantial portion of the audience. Regardless of how the experts scored the fight, spectators saw an unrelenting man who would not be knocked down. As far as they and LaMoka were concerned, it was a fight about who was the toughest, and everything outside of that was an insincere facsimile of violence. He represented honesty against all those who played and judged a game. Therefore, from a promoter's point of view, a third bout between LaMoka and Reeves was as good as a rubber match. This time, it was a vindication for the Bull and his supporters when he won the bout in the most honest manner possible. Jimmy Reeves was knocked out in the 6th round, and the two would never fight again. The next time Jimmy Reeves' name would be flagged up in the public interest was when his widow unsuccessfully tried to sue United Artists for appropriating the name, identity, likeness, character, ability, achievement and performance of her husband in Jake LaMota's 1980 biopic, Raging Bull. Between LaMota's resolving of the Reeves issue and Robinson's respectful bout with Armstrong, LaMoka fought 6 more times. He won all but one of these bouts. His loss marked a new feud, and one that had been inspired by an impromptu publicity stunt whilst LaMoka was training for his next fight after knocking out Reeves. Pittsburgh's Ozzie Harris was the man scheduled to be the Bull's new opponent, and LaMoka had travelled down to face him in his hometown. The local press were watching him spar at the gym of Walter J. Monk Ketchel. Ketchel is a county police officer and will rise to the rank of commissioner in 7 years' time, but has always been an avid sports fan. Basketball and boxing were amongst his passions, but he loved boxing and would readily spar professionals when they attended his gym. However, it wasn't Ketchel's attention that got the press interested that day. As LaMoka sparred in the ring, a one Fritzy Zivic was watching him and was only too happy to tell the reporters that although he was impressed with the Bull's work, he had the local Harris pegged to win. Zivic and LaMoka were asked by the press to get into the ring and face off for the cameras. They duly obliged, immediately sparking interest in a future bout. With Zivic smartly dressed in a suit displaying a playful, bemused smile, and LaMoka still in his shorts and wearing hand wraps, looking up through his eyebrows with a goading stare, the contrasts were obvious. The 10 years between them might as well be a generation. The caption at the bottom speculates, quote, "Someday they may meet in the same ring, but yesterday Fritzy Zivic just looked on while Jolton Jacob LaMoka worked out at Monk Ketchel's gymnasium," end quote. Pittsburgh is a city rich with boxing heritage. Arguably its first and greatest fighter to emerge was Harry the Pittsburgh Windmill Greb, the only man to beat the great Gene Tunney and unofficially the winner of 261 fights between 1913 and 1926. His official record was still an amazing 108 wins, with the other 179 bouts officially ruled as no contests. These have been scored as wins by the consensus of sports writers who attended the fights and known as newspaper decisions. Greb even fought 45 times in 1 year and would regularly fight above his weight class, claiming victories in welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight and heavyweight divisions. Greb was a fighter in every sense of the word, a master of the underhand tactics of the infight. He could take as much dirt as he could throw and fought for half of his career with one working eye, having lost the sight in the other from a gouge. Joining Greb later was Bob the Grinder Baker, Michael Moorer and the aforementioned Billy Conn. All would go down in boxing history as some of the greatest fighters that Pittsburgh has ever offered. Zivic's own record will finish at 158 wins of his 233-fight history. Born to immigrant parents of Croatian and Slovenian descent, Fritzy was one of 5 brothers who flourished in the art of boxing. He would later describe how the tough, crowded Ninth Ward neighbourhood of Lawrenceville, Pittsburgh, forged their fighting spirits. Quote, "You either had to fight or stay in the house. We went out." End quote. Zivic has sometimes been described as the greatest dirty fighter of all time. That's pretty high praise given the reputation of his Pittsburgh predecessor, Harry Greb, and not to mention his contemporary in the featherweight division, Sandy Sadler. However, what set Zivic apart from other brawlers was the coolness in which he executed his underhand savagery. When the clinch came, Zivic would freely use whatever weapons were at his disposal and hit whatever target appeared, rarely getting caught by an official. A type of hideous magic trick took place when a previously unmarked opponent would exit a Zivic clinch as if he had been passed through a meat grinder. He was like a surgeon with the clinical proficiency he brought to concealing headbutts, forearm smashes, elbow slashing, knee bumping, and the most notorious but forever denied instrument, his thumbs. We can thank fighters like Greb, Sadler and Zivic for the way modern boxing gloves now web the thumb to the rest of the glove to safeguard against all the jabs they put into the internal organs and gouges to the eyes. Nevertheless, for all the damaging work Zivic can do on the inside, he's a crack sharpshooter who likes to pick apart his opponents and slice them up. He put his head, literally and figuratively, to good use when he beat Henry Armstrong to win the undisputed world welterweight title by unanimous decision and then successfully defended it in their rematch with a technical knockout. Zivic lost the title to Freddie Cochran in 1942 and would also lose a third match with Armstrong. He'd also lost twice to Sugar Ray Robinson, the second time by technical knockout, but was still fighting the best in his weight division and winning more often than he lost. After a delay, the fight with LaMoka was finally set up for the 10th of June after Jake had proven Zivic's prediction wrong with a unanimous decision over Ossie Davis, which was then followed by knocking out Tony Ferrara. The contrasting styles of these two men, who weren't afraid to go into the trenches, made their fight a tantalising prospect. It was going to be about Zivic's cool-headed approach versus the unbridled savagery of LaMoka. Zivic had been boxing professionally for 12 years, LaMoka had been in the pro ranks for 2. When the fight had been originally set for the 24th of May, the odds put LaMoka ahead as the favourite at 11-5. Zivic replied with, quote, "Say, you put me on the short end of the odds against LaMoka? He's a busy slugger, but I'll box him. Sure, he's the only one that beat Sugar Ray Robinson, but that ain't gonna mean nothing Monday." End quote. These odds eventually dropped to 7-5 in favour of LaMoka after both men weighed in. LaMoka was 55.5 pounds, lower than usual, and Zivic was 151.5 pounds. The event was a box office success and drew in spectators across the country, including 2,500 soldiers. Amongst these men in uniform were LaMoka's father and Sergeant Barney Ross. A year after he had been commended and decorated for his brave actions in single-handedly fending off a dozen Japanese soldiers whilst defending his 4 wounded comrades. LaMoka won by split decision at the Forbes Field Pittsburgh Stadium, but this time it was his turn to be on the receiving end of cries of indignation. Now he had to endure 20 minutes of booing from a pro-Zivic crowd. For at least the first 7 rounds, Zivic had worked well from the outside, using his hand to inflict a nasty gash over the bull's right eye. When he had been rushed and pushed into the ropes, Zivic had responded by turning his opponent around in the clinch. To many in attendance, Zivic had given the young bullock a boxing lesson, providing the David Mamet's adage, quote, "Old age and treachery will always beat youth and exuberance," end quote. Even Barney Ross, who left in the 9th round, declared, quote, "Zivic will win easily," end quote. However, this was not the opinion of the referee and one of the judges. LaMoka, who liked to be known as much for his honesty as courage, admitted it was close and said he had no idea who'd won after he heard the last bell. After first declaring he was going to file for the decision to be overturned, Zivic went to the Pittsburgh Boxing Commissioners demanding a rematch. Citing the bygone days of boxing and apparently a wish LaMoka had expressed around town, he asked for a 20-round bout, believing he could finally wear the relentless bull down. Such a proposal was against Pennsylvania state law, but they agreed to a 15-rounder, something that was becoming increasingly rare for non-title bouts at the time. With damaging rumours and conspiracy theories flying about the public and media, Zivic did not need to try hard to get his rematch. They fought again, just over 1 month later on the 12th of July. This was a very different fight. LaMoka had come in heavier by 2 pounds and Zivic had shaved off half a pound since last time. LaMoka and his coaches had said the weight differences had thrown the Bronx Bull's fighting style. Zivic hadn't seemed to be his normal laid-back and bemused self during the pre-fight. His attitude at the time had been described as tense and crabby by his coach, Bobby Quinn. LaMoka, by contrast, displayed little emotion leading up to the fight. He was a picture of focused determination. This time, Zivic freely engaged in the brawling and LaMoka gave him plenty. When the fight was over, both men were sporting bloodied and swollen faces as well as yet another controversial split decision. However, this time it was scored in favour of Zivic, and many now thought LaMoka had been robbed. Meanwhile, Sugar Ray Robinson is experiencing a different type of controversy. Following his match with Henry Armstrong, it would appear his honeymoon period in the army is coming to an end, and there will not be any more scheduled leaves to fight in professional bouts. Much like Joe Louis, he'll be expected to put his boxing career on hold in favour of focusing on his military service. The two will be part of a team of pros who fight in exhibition bouts for the troops. Although Louis will do well to exert his influence to help segregated soldiers, Robinson will butt heads with his superior officers on the issue of race. On one occasion, he sided with Louis when the heavyweight champion was refused usage of a segregated phone booth. Vintage Detroit describes another more serious incident. Quote, "Even Louis had to contend with some of the same problems faced by ordinary black soldiers. Once he and fellow boxer Sugar Ray Robinson were waiting for a bus at Camp Seibert in Alabama when a white MP told them to move to the coloured station. 'What's my colour got to do with it?' said Joe, choking back his anger. 'I'm wearing a uniform like you.' 'Down here,' the MP responded, 'you do as you're told.' With that, he poked Joe in the ribs with his billy club. Moments later, Robinson jumped on the MP's back and all hell broke loose. Louis and Robinson were hustled over to the jailhouse, where a colonel listened to their stories. The arresting MP was bawled out and the boxers released. Meanwhile, word had gotten around the base. To diffuse the growing racial tension, Joe and Sugar Ray drove around in a jeep to show that everything was okay." End quote. Robinson and Louis both refused to fight exhibition bouts that don't allow African Americans to watch. Ultimately, Louis holds more sway than Robinson due to his status as world heavyweight champion, his defeat of Nazi Germany's Max Schmeling, and the large amount of propaganda he has been involved in around the time he signed up. His fight with Schmeling became the centre point, an allegory for the war, in award-winning director Colonel Frank Capra's documentary Negro Soldier. Louis is able to use his contacts in Washington to help desegregate the buses and stays with the army until the end of the war, rising to the rank of sergeant. However, Robinson will have a less easy ride out. On the 29th of March 1944, Sugar Ray Robinson is stationed in Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, and is due to ship out to Europe in order to take part in a series of military exhibition bouts. He disappears from his barracks that very day and is suspected of deserting. Indeed, this will be the story told to the press. Robinson next appears on the 5th of April in Fort J Hospital on Governor's Island, having missed the sailing. Apparently a stranger found him in a very bewildered state on the street on the 1st of April. Robinson claims amnesia, that he fell at the barracks and he cannot recall anything until the 5th of April. A doctor's examination confirms this to be the truth. Sergeant Walker Smith is honourably discharged on the 3rd of June on the grounds he suffered a mental deficiency. Sugar Ray Robinson has returned.